Fullmetal Alchemist, written and illustrated by Hiromu Arakawa, transcends its categorization as a shonen manga to function as a sustained philosophical inquiry into the structure of human desire, the inevitability of loss, and the moral consequences of transgression. While framed within a fictional world governed by alchemy, the narrative consistently resists escapist fantasy. Instead, it constructs a deterministic moral universe in which every act carries a cost and every attempt to bypass suffering results in deeper tragedy. At the core of this universe lies the principle of equivalent exchange, a law that is not merely scientific but ontological. It governs not only alchemy but human existence itself. The manga asks a deceptively simple question: if one desires something, what must one give in return? More importantly, it interrogates whether there exist things that cannot be bought at any price. Loss as the catalyst of meaning. The story begins not with ambition but with death. Edward and Alphonse Elric's journey is initiated by the loss of their mother, Trisha Elric, a loss that is not abstract but intimate, bodily, and irreversible. This origin point is crucial. The narrative does not present alchemy as a tool of empowerment but as a desperate response to grief. From a psychological standpoint, the brothers' attempt at human transmutation represents denial, the second stage of grief. Rather than accept mortality, they attempt to negate it through technical mastery. This aligns with trauma psychology, wherein individuals exposed to unbearable loss seek control through mastery, ritual, or obsessive competence. Alchemy, in this context, becomes a coping mechanism. Edward and Alphonse do not seek power for domination, they seek power to undo reality. This distinction is essential, as it grounds their moral failure not in malice but in human vulnerability. Equivalent exchange as moral ontology. Equivalent exchange is introduced early as a scientific principle. In order to obtain, something of equal value must be lost. However, the narrative quickly destabilizes this principle. While alchemy enforces material equivalence, human experience resists quantification. Love, life, and identity cannot be reduced to measurable components. This creates a philosophical tension. If reality operates on equivalent exchange and human desire seeks the infinite, then suffering becomes inevitable. The Elric brothers' failure in human transmutation is not a technical error, it is an ontological one. They attempt to treat life as a substance rather than a phenomenon. In doing so, they violate not only alchemical law but moral reality itself. Truth. The silent arbiter. The entity known as truth emerges as the metaphysical embodiment of equivalent exchange. It does not punish out of cruelty. It enforces balance without moral commentary. Truth does not argue, justify, or explain, it simply takes. This indifference is philosophically significant. Truth is not a god of justice, it is a god of structure. It mirrors natural law rather than moral law. In this sense, Fullmetal Alchemist aligns more closely with existentialist philosophy than religious moralism. There is no divine forgiveness, only consequence. Truth's silence forces characters to confront responsibility without the comfort of absolution. Alchemy as a false promise of control. Alchemy initially appears to offer rational mastery over chaos. Its diagrams, formulas, and transmutation circles suggest order and predictability. However, the narrative consistently demonstrates that alchemy is fundamentally limited. It can rearrange matter but not restore meaning. It can reconstruct bodies but not undo death. It can amplify power but not resolve guilt. This exposes alchemy as a technological illusion of omnipotence, paralleling modern anxieties surrounding science, progress, and ethical overreach. Alchemy as epistemology, knowledge, science, and human limits. In Fullmetal Alchemist, alchemy is not merely a fictional science or narrative device, it is a theory of knowledge. The practice of alchemy raises foundational epistemological questions. What can humans know? What should humans attempt to know? And where does the pursuit of knowledge transition from inquiry into transgression? Hiromu Arakawa constructs alchemy as a system that appears rational, systematic, and empirically grounded. Transmutation circles, equivalent materials, and energy conversion suggest a world governed by intelligible laws. However, the narrative persistently reveals that alchemy's epistemic structure is incomplete. Knowledge, while powerful, is shown to be ethically insufficient and psychologically dangerous when detached from humility. Alchemy operates under the assumption that the world is legible, that matter, life, and transformation can be fully understood through study and technique. This belief parallels Enlightenment rationalism, which posits that sufficient knowledge leads to mastery over nature. However, Fullmetal Alchemist systematically dismantles this assumption. While alchemy allows for extraordinary manipulation of matter, it consistently fails at moments requiring moral or existential comprehension. Human transmutation once again becomes the narrative's most decisive counterexample. The Elric brothers possessed sufficient technical knowledge, yet lacked ontological understanding. This exposes a critical epistemic gap. Knowing how is not equivalent to knowing whether. The epistemology of transmutation circles. Transmutation circles symbolize humanity's attempt to impose order on reality. Their geometric precision suggests completeness, finality, and closure. Yet, the repeated breaking of these circles through incomplete reactions, unintended consequences, or catastrophic failure reveals their symbolic fragility. From a philosophical standpoint, transmutation circles function as maps, not territories. They represent a model of reality, not reality itself. The belief that a model can fully capture the complexity of life becomes the foundational error of alchemical hubris. This mirrors contemporary critiques of scientism, wherein scientific models are mistakenly treated as exhaustive explanations rather than provisional tools. The psychological cost of knowing too much. Characters who pursue forbidden knowledge consistently exhibit psychological deterioration. Obsession, dissociation, and moral numbness emerge as recurring symptoms. Edward's insomnia, emotional repression, and hyperrationality illustrate the defensive mechanisms developed in response to epistemic trauma. Knowledge, once internalized without ethical integration, becomes burdensome rather than liberating. This challenges the traditional association between knowledge and virtue. In Fullmetal Alchemist, knowledge leads to isolation. Alphonse Elric and the crisis of epistemic selfhood. Alphonse's disembodied existence introduces a unique epistemological problem. How does one know oneself without physical continuity? His memories persist, yet his bodily experience is absent. This destabilizes the traditional philosophical association between embodiment and identity. Alphonse's doubt whether his existence is authentic or merely constructed mirrors philosophical skepticism regarding the self. The narrative suggests that self-knowledge is not purely cognitive, but relational and embodied. Without sensation, Alphonse's identity becomes fragile, contingent, and perpetually uncertain. Scar and alternative ways of knowing. Scar's relationship with alchemy contrasts sharply with that of the state alchemists. His rejection of Amestrian alchemy stems not from ignorance, but from moral insight rooted in lived suffering. Scar embodies experiential knowledge rather than technical expertise. His understanding of alchemy's dangers arises from its consequences, not its mechanisms. This positions him as a critique of purely intellectual epistemology. State alchemy. The state alchemists represent the formalization of knowledge into bureaucratic power. Certification, titles, and ranks grant legitimacy to certain forms of knowing while marginalizing others. This institutionalization creates a moral hazard. When knowledge becomes a tool of the state, its ethical evaluation is subordinated to utility. Alchemists are no longer seekers of truth, but instruments of control. From a sociological perspective, this reflects the dangers of technocratic governance, where expertise is weaponized and ethical accountability diffused. In Fullmetal Alchemist, sacrifice is not framed as heroic self-denial, nor is it romanticized as noble suffering. Instead, sacrifice is depicted as an unavoidable psychological consequence of action. Every transgression generates a cost, and that cost is not merely physical, it is internalized as guilt, trauma, and moral injury. The narrative interrogates sacrifice not as a voluntary exchange, but as an aftermath. Characters do not choose sacrifice as an ideal, they endure it as a residue of choice. The Philosopher's Stone and instrumentalized sacrifice. The Philosopher's Stone represents the extreme commodification of sacrifice. It transforms human lives into fuel, abstracting suffering into utility. From a psychological perspective, this abstraction enables moral disengagement. Characters involved in the stone's creation rationalize their actions by depersonalizing victims, reducing them to numerical equivalents. The stone thus becomes a symbol of ethical collapse where sacrifice is no longer endured but imposed. Mustang's pursuit of power is paradoxical. While ambition is often framed as corruptive, here it functions as an attempted moral repair. However, the narrative remains skeptical. Structural change does not automatically heal personal guilt. Mustang's emotional repression and delayed grief indicate unresolved trauma beneath strategic resolve. Power without introspection risks replicating the very systems it seeks to dismantle. In Fullmetal Alchemist, power is never morally neutral. It functions as a stress test for ethical integrity, revealing whether individuals and institutions treat human beings as ends or as means. State alchemy, in particular, embodies the transformation of knowledge into authority and authority into sanctioned violence. State alchemists are granted legal immunity, military rank, and social prestige. In exchange, their knowledge becomes state property. This arrangement exemplifies bureaucratized violence. Harm is rendered procedural, routinized, and impersonal. The alchemist no longer kills, he executes orders. Responsibility is diffused across chains of command, enabling moral disengagement. The narrative demonstrates that institutional legitimacy does not reduce ethical culpability, it obscures it. The Ishvalan genocide represents the narrative's most severe ethical rupture. The extermination is not framed as a tragic inevitability, but as a preventable failure of moral courage. State alchemists, despite individual doubts, comply. This compliance illustrates Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, wherein atrocity arises not from sadism, but from obedience, normalization, and careerism. The ethical collapse is gradual, not sudden. Instrumentalization of the body. Throughout Fullmetal Alchemist, bodies are treated as tools, soldiers, weapons, sacrifices. Alchemy accelerates this process by making physical transformation efficient and reversible. This instrumentalization strips individuals of inherent dignity. The narrative repeatedly challenges this logic, emphasizing the irreducibility of human worth. The Philosopher's Stone represents the ultimate violation, the conversion of life into resource, dehumanization as a precondition for power. The narrative demonstrates that power requires dehumanization to function smoothly. Enemies must be reduced to abstractions, casualties must be reframed as statistics. This process is psychological as much as political. Characters who resist dehumanization experience greater emotional distress, while those who accept it become increasingly detached. The cost of moral clarity is suffering. The homunculus as philosophical construct. The homunculi in Fullmetal Alchemist are not merely antagonists. They are conceptual experiments. Each represents an isolated human trait, exaggerated and severed from relational context. By externalizing these traits into autonomous beings, the narrative explores the dangers of moral reductionism, the belief that human complexity can be purified into singular virtues or vices. Fragmentation of the self. Human identity is inherently plural. Emotions, desires, and moral impulses coexist in tension. The homunculi violate this balance by embodying single aspects of human nature without restraint or integration. This fragmentation mirrors pathological states in psychology, where aspects of personality become dissociated or hypertrophied. The homunculi are thus not monsters in the traditional sense, they are unbalanced humans. Pride, surveillance, and the fear of exposure. Pride represents omnipresent observation and self-certainty. His ability to see everything symbolizes epistemic domination, the belief that total knowledge confers moral superiority. Psychologically, pride embodies narcissistic omniscience. His downfall reveals the fragility of identity built on control. When observation fails, so does selfhood. Pride's collapse illustrates the impossibility of complete self-sufficiency. Lust, desire without reciprocity. Lust is not erotic fulfillment, but desire detached from intimacy. Her existence reduces attraction to manipulation, stripping it of mutual recognition. This aligns with object relations theory, wherein others are treated as objects rather than subjects. Lust's inability to form genuine connection renders her existentially empty. Her death is significant. Desire without empathy cannot sustain itself. Envy, identity as comparison. Envy is defined by absence. His suffering arises from constant comparison with humans whose emotional bonds he lacks. Psychologically, envy reflects identity diffusion. Without intrinsic self-worth, the self is constructed negatively defined by what it is not. His ultimate despair underscores the corrosive nature of comparison-based identity. Greed, possession as substitute for meaning. Greed's hunger extends beyond material wealth to relationships, power, and existence itself. Yet possession never satisfies. This mirrors consumerist psychology, wherein accumulation replaces connection. Greed's arc diverges from other homunculi, suggesting the possibility of moral reintegration through relational attachment. Greed's partial redemption emphasizes that desire is not inherently corrupt, only unexamined desire is. Sloth, the violence of avoidance. Sloth embodies avoidance rather than laziness. His destruction results from resistance to responsibility and moral engagement. Psychologically, sloth represents learned helplessness, a refusal to act to escape discomfort. The narrative frames inaction as ethically violent, reinforcing that passivity perpetuates harm. Wrath, order through destruction. Wrath seeks peace through control. His belief in necessary violence reflects authoritarian psychology, where fear justifies domination. Wrath's internal conflict reveals the instability of imposed order. Violence creates compliance, not harmony. His demise underscores the futility of control without consent. Gluttony, consumption without awareness. Gluttony lacks reflective consciousness. His endless consumption symbolizes compulsion without understanding. From a psychological perspective, gluttony resembles addictive behavior, action divorced from meaning. His emptiness literalizes the hollowness of excess. Father, the ultimate fragmentation. Father represents the extreme conclusion of fragmentation, the desire to eliminate human limitation entirely. By discarding emotional traits, he seeks transcendence. However, this pursuit results in absolute isolation. Without desire, fear, or attachment, Father becomes static and purposeless. His failure demonstrates that humanity's imperfections are not flaws to be eliminated, but conditions of meaning. At the metaphysical core of Fullmetal Alchemist lies a single persistent question. What happens when humans attempt to exceed the boundaries of their condition? Alchemy, while framed as a science, functions primarily as a vehicle for exploring transgression acts that violate not merely laws, but existential limits. Truth serves as the narrative's metaphysical arbiter, confronting transgressive desire without moral rhetoric or emotional judgment. The gate of truth, epistemic confrontation. The gate represents the threshold between permissible and forbidden knowledge. Crossing it exposes individuals to totality and infinite comprehension that cannot be integrated. Rather than enlightenment, this exposure results in loss. This suggests that human cognition requires a limitation to function meaningfully. Knowledge without proportion becomes destructive. Edward's psychological transformation. Edward's maturation is marked by a shift from self-sacrifice to mutual dependence. Early in the story, he assumes that suffering alone can atone for harm. By the later arcs, Edward recognizes that refusing help is not moral strength, but moral isolation. Accepting aid becomes an ethical act. This psychological shift reflects a move from guilt-driven morality to relational responsibility. Alphonse and the affirmation of self. Alphonse's arc culminates in self-affirmation. He rejects the notion that his existence is contingent or illegitimate. This moment is philosophically significant. Identity is affirmed not through physicality or autonomy, but through recognition by others. Alphonse becomes fully human not by regaining a body, but by asserting relational worth. Brotherhood as ethical resistance. Brotherhood becomes a form of resistance against systems that fragment and instrumentalize. The brothers' refusal to abandon each other resists both metaphysical and political violence. Their bond is not sentimental, it is defiant. The conclusion of Fullmetal Alchemist is philosophically radical precisely because it refuses transcendence. There is no apotheosis, no final mastery of alchemy, no elevation beyond the human condition. Instead, the narrative ends with a renunciation, a conscious decision to relinquish power in exchange for relational wholeness. Alchemy as instrument, not essence. Throughout the manga, alchemy gradually shifts in meaning. Initially presented as identity-defining Fullmetal Alchemist, it is ultimately revealed to be instrumental rather than essential. Edward's final realization is not that alchemy is evil, but that it is insufficient. It can rearrange matter, but it cannot generate meaning. It can facilitate survival, but not justify existence. The decision to abandon alchemy reframes it as a tool subordinate to ethical life, not its foundation. The refusal of godhood. Edward explicitly rejects godhood, declaring that humans do not need to be gods to live meaningful lives. This statement is the narrative's philosophical thesis. It directly counters Father's ideology and resolves the series' metaphysical tension. Divinity is not an aspiration, it is a misunderstanding. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.